Hello, everyone. Welcome to the March 26th edition of our regularly scheduled Scientific Governance and Risk meeting. My name is Richard Brown. I'm the head of community development at MakerDAO. Today we have a wide range of topics to get to. Part of the regroup, I guess, after the events of the last couple of weeks is going to be it's going to be interesting to watch. So here's what I've been noticing. We have, over the course of the last few months, perhaps longer, we run through these cycles of urgency, apathy, denial, and then maybe we'll tack on a new cycle, urgency, apathy, denial, activity, possibly, who knows. Where we know we have to do something rapidly, that's the urgency. That thing gets done or something else happens, that's the apathy stage. The problem goes away, then we go into the denial stage and we start thinking about other stuff. And then the activity stage where some new event comes along and then we focus all of our attentions on those things. That's a fundamental flaw in human nature and humans in general, is that it's hard for us to hold a number of disassociated ideas in our heads at exactly the same time. And maintaining these threads over the course of days, weeks, or months is a huge ask. And so with the way that our governance ecosystem needs to develop over the course of, well, in the future, we're going to have to come up with some plans and some processes to come back and revisit things that were important that got shelved, and start doing a better job at predicting what's going to be important in the future and making sure that we have initiatives split off to address those things. And I think that one of the many painful teaching moments that we've all experienced over the course of the last few weeks is going to help us make the system more robust. And we're already seeing evidence of that happening, because today, for the first time in a long time, we have too many different things to talk about and not enough time to talk about them. Frequently, we pick one or two big subjects and we dig into those. Today, we have maybe 7 or 8 big subjects. These are growing pains, but they're extremely healthy growing pains, because what this means is that the community is increasingly improving its ability to self-coordinate, its sophistication, it's identifying problems that need to be solved, and then coming up with plans to solve them. And that is precisely what this governance ecosystem should be about. It's not top down, it's flat. It's not centralized, it's decentralized, and it's being kickstarted. And so it's easy to sort of pick it apart and figure out what's wrong, but I'm more focused right now on how it's improving on a week-to-week basis. And this is one of those improvements that make me very, very, very happy. And so I'm not going to talk too much about how happy that makes me. Instead, let's talk about what the agenda is today, and then we'll break off into some of these discussions. So Kurt is going to give us a recap of the flop auction poll in the forums. There was a decision to be made last week, where our cadence is messed up, earlier in the week at our last governance call about whether there's going to be a separate executive, whether the executive gets bundled. There's some issues there. There's also a tweak or an added feature in this this vote that could impose a delay to make the entire process more rational, and he'll discuss that. Rich, I just realized now that I don't know how to pronounce your last name adequately, so forgive me for what I'm about to do. Rich Cuellar-Lopez. Is that close enough? All right, thanks. I'll try harder next time. Is going to tell us about an emergency shutdown working group slash DeFi space consortium. And this is a really, really great initiative. I'm not going to get into it too much because he's given it far more thought than I have. So the idea is that we have stakeholders in the space, and those stakeholders are impacted by the decisions of this community, and we need to engage with those stakeholders. And so a hero has arisen, and Rich will tell us about that a bit. Mariano is going to tell us about some new recent events in the Maker Token Authority world. which I believe people should be excited to hear about if they haven't already, because I'm excited. LongforWisdom is going to talk about Forum at a glance, possibly about USDC stability fees. I don't know if I've actually mentioned that to him yet. That might come as a surprise. Marko is going to talk to us about some analysis he's done on USDC. We're going to talk a bit about, and maybe try to attempt to get back to some normalcy here. Obviously, we're not out of the woods yet, but we'll have the comforting and dulcet tones of Vishesh walking us through the state of the pegs, and Primoz might be giving us a review of the state of migration. So obviously, lots and lots to go through, lots of disparate chats. As always, in these calls, this is not a decision-making forum. This is a broadcasting of information, a discovery tool where ideas and brainstorming happens, and then we move into the forums, and that's where proposals get written and consensus gets reached, and then next steps get determined. So let's do our best to get through our agenda today, and then let's ensure that we all break off into forum posts and meetings afterwards. Okay, there we go. That's the agenda. I'm not sure who would be best to start off with. Maybe I'll just go in the order of my notes. Kurt, do you want to give us a super brief recap of what's going on with the flop auction?
Yep, let's do that. Thank you, Rich. All right, I'm going to share screen really briefly here, everyone. All right. Hopefully everyone can see these forum poll results up on their screen right now. So just to recap a little bit, this Tuesday, we kind of discussed that unblocking flop auctions, well, it was a priority. We went into the technical details of how they got blocked, so I won't recap any of those details today, so refer to the other call or the slides, or ask me afterwards if you have questions. But the question at hand was, how do we organize our executives to do this unblocking of the 20 stuck flop auctions? One option was to have 2 executives, one that was just for unblocking the dead auctions, and then we can have our normal monetary policy one. The cadence of those would be basically that the unblocking spell would come first, and then after the monetary policy, if any monetary policy changes are made this week. Then we also had options for just 1 vote for the whole week that had everything, and then 1 vote on Friday only to unblock flop auctions. And as you can see here, the leading option in the poll is to have 2 executives, 1 for unblocking the flop auctions and 1 for everything else. So let's talk a little bit about the details of what that spell to unblock the flop auctions would look like and what it would do. So as I described last time, there's a way to transmute all this stuck debt back into a form that can be flopped, but that's probably not all the spell should do, right? Because if you think about it, if we just convert things back into a form where flop auctions can be started, we could have the same bug actually reoccur again as keepers start triggering the auctions and bidding on them simultaneously. You could actually have to do this over and over again. The process does converge because they can only block at most half the auctions each time, but that would be very annoying. So what we can make the spell do is also kick off all of the flop auctions as soon as it is cast. And so that means we get them all kicked off, none of them can be blocked, and we're in good shape. But then there's a further consideration after that, which relates to the timing of things, which is, it's very hard to predict when is a spell actually going to get cast, because that depends on when people voted in. And those aren't great conditions for participants in these auctions, because it's basically a random time, so they've got to be standing by 24/7 waiting for the spell to get voted in, and invariably it'll be an inconvenient time of the day for someone, and that can reduce participation in the auctions. It also allows, for example, if anyone participating is also a large MKR holder, they could try to time the auctions favorably for themselves by getting the spell to be voted in and passed at a particular time. There is, of course, the governance delay, so I guess everybody has 4 hours of warning, but still it would be desirable to put a deterministic time into the spell, and it doesn't have to be just one time. It could be, for example, it can be triggered any weekday at noon Eastern time, for example, and that's just an example. You're never going to pick a time that's great for everyone. The point is just to make it predictable so that the kickoff time is known, and all the participants can be ready to go, and there can be maximum efficiency in that process. So I think with that, I'll stop sharing and open it up for discussion.
I think there's an active discussion happening in this sidebar, but I might subvert the point of this call and just to summarize them from my own perspective. So there's an issue at play here, and I think I touched on this at our last call, is that if we split these executives up as its peers, we are going to do this is a gun that can only be fired once a week. And so that means that the clock is kind of ticking as of the second we all scramble to get that executive into the portal, which is going to happen right after this call. And that's going to give the ecosystem less than 24 hours to assemble their hardware wallets and get that vote passed. And so there's some campaigning that's required to make this thing happen. So if people feel strongly about wanting this to go through in the very small window we have available to make that happen, please, I encourage you to actually come on, vote. That's a good start. Even if you're a smallish holder, let's not get into that conversation again. It's worth voting. So please, even if you're not a whale, vote. Whales follow the crowd here. And if you have access to large holders, convince them to vote and consider doing some public campaigning. So if people on this call want this vote to go through, take to the Twitters and sharpen your pitchforks and work on your PR. So we need to rally on this vote, or else it's not going to happen. Here's my little addition. There were some comments in the sidebar. MakerMan, I see your name prominently displayed. Do we have any other comments?
So there was some discussions of like the pros and cons of doing two, essentially. Okay. The point being that like it splits Maker and stuff over more executives. STD is still vulnerable to flash loan attacks.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think that this is something. It's another long discussion, or another apathy, urgency, and denial discussion. Here's a good example. We're seeing some cracks in the mechanism of continuous approval voting. We've been seeing those cracks for a long time, and this is one of the things that we as a community need to revisit sometime soon. Is as the complexity of our protocol, our governance ecosystem ramps up almost exponentially. Is the system that we have in place right now going to cover us? I don't expect anybody to provide the answers right now, but let's think about that, because this is not going to be a one-off case. Well, it isn't, because we've had to ask ourselves these questions 4 or 5 times now, and we're back in the same place where something important needs to happen. How do we do that in a way that doesn't risk a weak executive or reducing the security of the system or splitting votes among various.
And in this particular case, I'd be interested to hear the discussion on the rest of the call, because it's not clear to me how much monetary policy we really have to play with right now in the system. Rates are 0. I've seen discussion of tweaking debt ceilings, but do we expect any of that to have a large effect on the system, or is any of that urgent compared to getting $1 million in bad debt cleared and freeing up however much DAI is being held on the sidelines with the intention of participating in these auctions? Because remember, even if you've only got 2 people competing, 2 entities competing, you're locking up at least twice the amount of DAI that's going to be consumed in the auctions, assuming they're gunning to win it all, so to speak. So
Well, you raised another good point, and this is, I call it a good point because it also reinforces the point I was just trying to make. So it's got to be good. So in the before times, back like 3 or 4 weeks ago, we were talking about the cadence of monetary policy as well, and potentially the need to start acquiring some models and some numbers, some empirical evidence that shows that the levers we pull have the effects that we assume, because it's possible that moving number up or down 1% every week might not be having the impact that we assume it is, and perhaps in the absence of a more nuanced voting mechanism, maybe we can free up every second week to actually do things that are not monetary policy. So that's a discussion that's worth having again very soon. Kurt, did you have any other points you wanted to raise, or does that cover your topic for today?
I think that covers the state of things. I think if you're giving me a soapbox for another seconds here, I'll say, I think the most important thing we can do for the system right now is clearing out the remaining flop auctions. It's not clear whether people holding DAI to participate in those is having an effect on the upward pressure on the peg or not, but the only way to kind of empirically find out if that has anything to do with them is to get them cleared. And it's not even clear to me that there are other actions we need to take that are on the same order of magnitude and importance.
All right, well, that's good observation. So let's, if people feel strongly about this, as I said, please consider some public campaigning today to shake some of those heavy bags into action.
Do we need to discuss the delay at all? Like, Kurt, you brought that up. Like, it's in like, do we want to delay the flop auctions to a certain time? Like,
I mean, basically the intention is to give them predictable start times.
Yeah, it makes sense, I think.
Like say the thing I'm thinking about right now would be, say they can be started between 9 a.m. and noon on a weekday Eastern time or something like that.
Does that require consensus, or can somebody just make an, like, it doesn't really matter, does it? Like, can somebody just pick, like whoever's writing the spell, just pick a weekday that's realistic, that's predictable, that's people can just use. It's about minimizing an absurd time. So I don't know.
It's creating certainty more than anything else, and predictability.
It's going to be hard to find something that makes sense for everybody, but maybe just like for this, like as I continue to point out, that we iterate here, we don't set things in stone forever. So maybe this time somebody can just pick whatever, Monday, Tuesday at 9 PST or 5 UTC or something, I don't know. And then we can just iterate next week and have a longer discussion if we have to do this again. All right, I think I'm going to stick a fork in that one. I'm aggressively going to follow the agenda today because there's no chance we're going to be able to get to everything. So Rich, I want to hand this off to you because you have some impressive stuff on the go here, and it'd be great to get this in front of the community.
Cool. Thanks for the kind words. I'm not sure how much I'll show on a kind of a share screen, but I'll just go through. Please try and hold me to like 3 minutes or so. The idea with kind of a working group for emergency shutdown is really to create a framework and a roadmap for a DeFi consortium, especially as it relates to MCD emergency shutdown. We could talk about, where Psi fits in right now, or, other parameters, but really, like, if we had to use an ES, what would it mean? And I think this is meant for more collecting feedback and other deliverables that would be help on a preemptive basis, more for people who may not be on this call and aren't part of the foundation or the community. What this is not, it's not trying to press, the MakerDAO or, token holders to immediately shut down anything, or really force anyone's hands as to whether, you need to dictate or codify. We still want people to have flexibility and be able to use their vote for what they think is sensible as a shutdown. And really, this is more just for a discussion of that. Who would be part of this consortium? Ideally, it would just from the start, it would be a couple of members from different DeFi projects. So if you wanted to have, some people from Compound or Dharma or other big hitters, you could, but then, really anyone who's built on the Maker protocol would be eventually part of it. And, maybe that ends up being a lot bigger of a community.
Break it down a bit. So you're kind of talking about, A, let's clarify what the actual steps are, what this means, and then B, identify stakeholders in the ecosystem to try and build some bridges. So because we don't live in a vacuum here, right? So trying to make sure we understand who this affects and who should have a say and all the rest of it, right?
Yeah, I think it's kind of like initially identify people who have skin in the game, who, this actually affects what they're, biddling. And like, if there was an ES, it would materially change things. Now, maybe we throw in a couple of whales in there too, but initially it's kind of like identify the key people. And then what we do is we set the parameters for, and not in a technical sense, but kind of set a framework for like what should be discussed preemptively, what should be, happening during an ES, and what can happen for, others to recover were an ES to happen. And kind of like having that whole timeline in place. So, if something did happen suddenly next week, everyone could kind of go to that framework and work with that. And maybe there ends up being no consensus on what that framework is, but, reality is, I think, especially people outside this community, they're not going to just want to jump on daily calls, at weird times to, discuss things in real time. You kind of want something to mitigate it. And so, yeah, and then just to go on, like, I think right now where we're at is there's going to be a working group forum post to go up in the next couple of days. There's a doc right now where we have a couple of reviewers. So shout outs to Mitote, other Rich, Cyrus. Thanks for looking through. I could use a couple of other people to review it, and then it will be posted for public. And then kind of second thing that would be helpful would be if there are any people on this call who would want to be part of these discussions. So mainly, people who are ideally outside of like the Maker community and like not regularly on these calls, but, their work really does get affected by everything that the Maker protocol, dictates. I think those people would be helpful. And then additionally, if like some of those people are not on this call, but they would be interested, you can send them my way. And I think in the next week or two, we'll kind of have this initial like charter or framework. And then, we'd probably have a virtual call with those interested people and see what deliverables we want to work on. So that's kind of what some of the conversations have been going on with this working group. And I apologize if that was too much longer than 3 minutes.
No, it's perfect. And it was worth the extra minute, because this is something that I've been nervous about for the longest time, is that we have this boogeyman in the system, or this game theoretical security mechanism. But I don't feel that there's enough clarity on what it actually means and how it actually works and when it should actually happen. And so it's a discussion that we've all been having every once in a while for a long time, but to see some direct effort applied to creating some clarity around this thing, I think is enormously valuable. So thanks for heading that up.
Great. And I'll just do one more quick shout out. If someone wants to pitch in like 10 minutes of just reviewing a doc, or they actually want to be actively involved, feel free to hit me on Rocket Chat, or, I think most people, I'm not really anonymous with my handle here. It's my actual name. So reach out to me, and I'll try and get as much participation as possible. Thanks.
Yeah, you're RCL on Rocket Chat, right?
Yeah, RCL.
Nice. All right, cool. Thanks for that. I appreciate it. Mariano, do you want to tell us about new events with the Token Authority?
Yeah, for sure. So I do have slides. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes. I feel bad after, seeing Kurt's slides from the other day. Mine are so bad, but it's what we got, right? So you probably know that we came out with a blog post yesterday saying that the foundation multisig had relinquished its ownership on the MKR token. I'm just going to tell you quickly what this means. So and why I think, and everybody should think that it is a really big deal. So in single collateral DAI, this is the MKR token. This is governance, because I love you all so much. And it was only the DS chief. The MKR token, it's a database of, how many tokens each address has, but it also has some restricted functions, right? It is a token that can be minted and burned.
I lost your audio, Mariano.
Oh, really? Can you hear me now?
I don't think so. I heard him the whole time.
I can hear Mariano fine still. It's weird.
I can hear him too.
Okay, gonna keep talking. Let me know if anybody cannot hear me. And this MKR token, it has two specific values, an owner and an authority. And the owner has always been the Maker Foundation multisig. And it didn't have any authority. Authority can be a smart contract that has, additional logic. And in single collateral DAI, we really didn't need anything too complicated, because the MKR token was only used to pay for stability fees, and they would go into the burner, what we call the gempit. And if you remember, this balance kept growing, but it wasn't really burned, right? It didn't affect supply. This MKR would go to this contract, and we always said that it would eventually be burned, but no contract had the authority to do so, right? So just after we released MCD, the governance changed to the POS proxy, governance with the delay. The DS chief would be a little bit further back. But now we needed certain things, right? So for flopper auctions, which we saw happen this week and last week, the contract needs the authority to mint MKR, right? And the flopper auctions, they need the authority to burn MKR and also the gempit. So what happened was that an MKR authority was created. And this MKR authority gave authorizations to all of these contracts to do things on the MKR token. So the flopper can, call mint MKR when an auction ends. So whoever wins it, they get that amount of MKR. And these two, the flapper and the gempit, I put them here, but essentially anybody now has authority to burn their own MKR supply. This is not unlike, a transfer from. You have authority to transfer your tokens to somebody else. You have the same authority to burn your own tokens. I hope you don't do it. These contracts, they do it because it's part of the system, right? So the main thing that happened is that the Maker Foundation multisig, like before yesterday, both the multisig and the MKR authority could call this restricted functions, right? And even though the multisig never did it, it still had authority to mint MKR or burn its own MKR. It could change ownerships, it could change authorities. So what it did, the multisig set the owner address of the token to 0. And this is really a big deal, because now everything has to go through this bottom authority thing. And who owns this MKR authority? Every single one of you, right? Governance. So this is the next big step in the system. It may not seem like much, but it is incredibly powerful. So now anything that needs to happen that needs authority on the token, if we need to replace the flopper, which we will possibly need to do to prevent any further dead auctions becoming stuck, it all needs to happen through governance. So I put a little uncomplaint here because this is really a big deal. And if you wanna check this, like if you go to the Etherscan to the Maker token, you will see that the owner is now 0. The authority is, this Maker Authority. And who is the owner, the root of the Maker Authority? The POS proxy. So every single one of you. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I just wanted to stress that this is really a big deal, and it's another incentive yet again to keep voting and keep participating. That's all I have.
Thanks, Mariano. It's sort of painful that such an amazingly cool thing happened at such a tumultuous time. It's probably not going to get the attention it deserves, but thanks for keeping the fire lit under this thing. I know that it's been a passion project of yours for a while to make sure that this authority has been handed out to the ecosystem.
Just really quick, yeah, the first document that I drafted to do this is probably 1.5 years old. Yes.
All right, well, thanks again, man. Cool, and also thank you for powering through that thing. We'll forgive the fact that a lot of your arrows didn't actually align with the boxes in light of how important the actual message was. Long, do you want to talk about governance at a glance?
Yeah, certainly. Cool. So, yeah, I think most of the kind of active discussions and signaling threads are going to be things people have heard of already, because we've been talking about them for the last week. But I'll go over them anyway. So actually, there's one that maybe people are not aware of, which is MyTotes created a thread about updating the signaling guidelines, which is what we use for, well, what we supposedly use for making signal threads. So we've kind of been using the signaling process for a while. We're kind of getting a better idea of what works well and what works less well. So we're now in a better position to sort of start saying yes, we should do this rather than we should do that. So I'd encourage people to use the process and to signal in the process to read that and understand what may change and sort of give feedback on what they think should change, or if anything. Cool. So signaling wise, again, most of these things are going to be stuff that we've already discussed. So that thread Kurt mentioned about the about finishing the flops and figuring out how we're going to structure executives. So obviously there's the signal threads continuing around compensating vault holders. That's not going away until we figure out what we're doing. So I would suggest people to signal on that if they haven't. Interesting, perhaps as expected, that's one of the most signaled in signals I think we've ever had, presumably because vault holders are signaling it as well. But just a point of interest. Then also we've got the signal thread for SCD shutdown created by Aaron, which is still up, discussing when we should shut down SCD, given the risks. And also it's worth noting in that thread is a post from Derek, which lays out the rough series of steps that we need to actually shut down SCD. That maybe went a little bit under the radar. So this is stuff like what order we need to do certain operations in, such as shutting down the bridge, which direction of transfer we shut down, how we handle clearing out the migration, SCI to DAI or DAI backed by SCI and stuff like that. So we'll find the link.
So I have a question for the Maker Foundation. I was wondering if you guys have any internal plans for anything in regards to SCD shutdown put in place. I know you guys, we needed a portal or something. And the reason I ask is because right now polling for shutdown is 64% less than a month from today. So I was thinking of making a poll for like 2 weeks out, 3 weeks out, 4 weeks out, see what how many weeks we actually want to do shutdown from.
Yeah, that's a great point, and thanks for bringing it up actually, because this is a discussion we've been having internally for a while. So let me fill you guys in. For there to be a clear path for the community to shut down SCD, there's a few different things that need to happen almost in concert, or at least rapid succession. One of those is a clear understanding in the ecosystem of what mechanically actually needs to happen and what development needs to occur and what steps. And, so the community can wrap its head around how quickly, how feasible is it and in what time frame, right? So the community might want it to happen in a day, but it takes like 8 days to make this thing happen. That's going to be an issue. Once the technical mechanical steps have been pushed out to the forums, then it's my expectation that the community can start to align around a process to wrap around the way that the world works. And once that process exists, then time estimations can start and scheduling can begin. That's I could be off base and I'm unwilling to be disagreed with, but it feels like that's the order of operations. Like how, or what are the mechanical steps? How does the community wrap our governance around what the actual steps are mechanically or in the smart contracts? And then how does the community align on a timeline, I think. And the foundation right now is about to, actually I'm not gonna put people on the spot. I think you know who you are if you're in the call and you want to pipe up about the docs, but there's docs coming that will give a very detailed breakdown of what mechanically it looks like and what different pieces need to happen and in what order. And then I think after that, Aaron, your team will be able to, maybe that's overstating things, but you and the other people that are involved can descend on that and kind of figure out how that works. And I think there's also a possibility here for some significant alignment with what Rich is up to as well. Other Rich, by the way, you're the other Rich, not me. What the other Rich is up to, and then maybe everybody can coordinate together, because it feels like this is definitely like a three-pronged approach that needs to happen.
I just want to highlight again, because some people are still not quite understanding. The post I just linked in that thread is the post that Derek created, which lays out what needs to happen for SED to be shut down completely. So like there's like eight steps of what needs to happen in a more order.
Yeah, we have something that's
not
far more
in great
detailed on the way.
Yeah, not in great detail, but yeah.
Yeah, thanks Long for linking to that. What I'm going to do, I'm talking with the smart contract guys later on today. I'll create a new post which adds a bit more color and depth to those very high level steps, just so everyone is clear. I think also, Aaron, to your question, I think internally we're looking to the community a lot in terms of when you guys collectively were all looking to do the shutdown. So I'm also building an SCD shutdown page, which will be part of the migration.MakerDAO page. That is due to be completed tomorrow. It's been in the works for a while. So there's no real dependency on that work that's getting done. So yeah, I'm happy for you to put the poll up whenever you guys are ready, because we are really looking to the community for input on when you want to do this. So yeah, hopefully that helps.
That's perfect. That's exactly what I was going to ask. So thanks for that.
Yeah, so it sounds like we potentially need to create an on-chain poll, sort of saying whether we want to shut it down in like a month or something, or like figuring out.
Yeah, definitely. I feel slightly more comfortable or confident in the success of the process if like Aaron and Derek and Rich and whoever else was super interested in this process coordinated together before we started putting, just to make sure that like a poll doesn't go up and it turns out that for reason X it's impossible to execute on the results of that poll or something.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that and add that it would be nice. It's unclear to me whether any of those steps in there are sequential, and some attention paid to governance. Like, do we do one executive that just does it all and it can all flop out? Or do we have to do one thing first with one executive and then do another executive to finish it off? And so if we can see that clearly, then we can understand what the timeline can be and then figure out how we vote on this or poll it. So that's all I have to say.
Yeah, precisely. Once the mechanism is understood, then we can wrap governance around it, or change the mechanism to fit the requirements of governance. But
I would just point out that potentially the poll can be like indicative rather than like declarative, right? It can say like you can sort of be agreeing to like by make a vote like to aim to shut down thing. We will
Sure.
definitely do
Yeah,
this.
I was just trying to caution that.
Yeah.
Sometimes some things just aren't possible. So we still
Yeah,
just
yeah,
want to
no,
make sure. Yeah. Cool.
That's what I think. But sort of agreeing on like aim rather than agreeing on like states kind of helps get around that, right? We can say like we will aim to do this, and then maybe it comes 2 weeks late because of reasons or something. But yeah.
Well, sounds good.
All right, cool. Long, did you have any other threads that you wanted to dig into?
Wait, sorry, just before we move on. So how are we going to proceed operationally? So are we waiting on Derek, or are we waiting on someone else to kind of put together like a high level plan, or do we just want to maybe even start with some of these items that we already know have to be done one way or another? So for the one I'm referring to is stopping the SI to DAI migration contract just one way, not two ways, is something that's going to have to happen anyways, because it just creates way too many edge cases to have that bridge open. Migration has slowed down more or less. I'm not saying we have to do this immediately or it's urgent, but given that there's multiple steps to the process and it may take, say, 1 week or one vote for many of these items, I think we should try to move sooner rather than later, just because there's a lot of things to get through for SCD shutdown.
I'd be happy to look at the SCD debt ceiling independent of the emergency shutdown plan. I think that precedes the whole global settlement.
Right. Would that be as simple as just setting the side migration debt ceiling to 0? Is that all it takes, or is there are there other technical things that need to happen?
I think there may be implications that I need to discuss with smart contracts team and yourself, because I don't know what that would do in terms of liquidity impacts to people. So I think from the comments I've seen in the side panel, definitely yes, call with smart contracts, and yourself, Cyrus, make sure I put that into a forum post, make sure people can review it, and then Long, I'll get with you in terms of how we want future messaging of this piece of work to go forward.
Just to clarify something super important here, there's 2 separate debt ceilings that are being discussed right now. One is the main SCD debt ceiling that's currently set to 20 million or whatever, but then there's the debt ceiling for the SI migration special collateral type in MCD. And I think that's the one that needs to be set to 0 or dealt with in some way in order to prevent any further migration from SI to DAI.
I'll just say as well, Derek, feel free to like sort of loop Aaron in on all of these things. And in terms of like messaging specifically, we like a couple of people who volunteered to sort of work on like communications and PR stuff. So
yeah, absolutely. Do we want to talk about as a group the setting debt ceiling to 0 now? I see there's a bit of chat in the side. Do we want to go into that? Do we have time?
What are the technical ramifications? Is that something you need to talk about, or can we just put an on-chain poll on Monday for that and see if people are down for that?
Yeah, let's try to gather up some posts in the next few days, and then we'll maybe we can put a governance poll on Monday about the migration contract debt ceiling. Or Gonzalo says there's 2 ways to do it: either setting the debt ceiling to 0 or caging the SI adapter.
Yeah, I would say that if you set the debt ceiling to 0, you can still set it back, right? If you cage it, that's pretty much a one-way street. Yeah. Which, of course, we do want to set it, we do want to freeze it somehow, right? But in case we would need to unfreeze it for some reason, I mean, we'll all get together, we'll figure it out, and we'll come back with more information.
Okay, cool. Rich, you want to move on?
I should unmute myself. Yeah, I think that this is a point to I hand it over to you, Cyrus, if you want to take risk.
Yeah, I was finished. Sounds good.
Oh, okay. Cool. Give me 1 second. Right. So, okay. One topic I wanted to talk about today was revisiting USDC. A lot of buzz and activity going on around USDC as a collateral type. I want to just remind people that there is this active discussion going on about the use case for USDC, whether it is primarily intended for DAI peg liquidity or kind of emergency auction keeper liquidity. Let me try to find that link. Right, maybe somebody else can find that link and post it in the sidebar. And the reason this is important is we've seen usage from the USDC collateral type for both reasons, for both use cases. Some people are using it to participate in the flop auctions, and others are using it for DAI peg management. Now, though, the flops are coming to a close, and the DAI peg is still above $1. And people are wondering, how can we get more DAI out of the USDC collateral type? And that would imply lowering the stability fee on USDC so that it can better accommodate the DAI peg. But that presumes that we've kind of really come to a consensus on what we want out of this collateral type. So I think we should discuss that. But first, I think maybe we can just run through the data really quickly too on what people have been using USDC for.
Can I just add one point to that before we get into that?
Sure.
The poll that we had this week up for the debt ceiling on USDC has finished with like 17K maker in favor of reducing it to like 16.
Right.
Yeah.
For the stability fee, not the debt ceiling.
Yeah.
Right?
For the stability fee.
Right. Yeah. The governance poll passed for a reduction in the stability fee. So in a way, governance MCARE voting is sort of driving this narrative right now, but so we need to kind of catch up quickly. Okay, with that being said, let's jump into the data a bit. Marko, are you on the call?
Yeah, I'm here. Let me just present just a second. Okay, can everybody see the spreadsheet?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So hi guys, this is me first time speaking here, so maybe a bit of introduction. I'm primarily working with Primoz, who you already know. We are mainly focusing on analyzing DeFi ecosystem, and for the recent few months, I'm also working with Cyrus and Vishesh. So one of the things I was working on in the recent few days is analyzing USDC vaults. And basically, I was interested in what these guys are doing with the DAI debt. So the first thing which I wanted to know is basically the structure of these vaults, as you can see in this table. And basically, it's quite concentrated into a few vaults. So basically, the first vault represents about 40% of debt, and basically 5 vaults combined present 82% of debt, and 10 vaults present about 90% of debt, which means that basically analyzing this 10 vaults activity kind of give us a good picture of what is going on with the DAI. So here on this chart, you can see aggregated DAI minting per day by these 10 vaults. Red bars represent newly minted DAI each day, and the black bars are basically aggregated debt. As you can see, the DAI minting activity was much stronger during first few days. Actually, the largest vault has already started to repay some of the debt. I think that main causes for this are two. The first one is basically the peg. In the initial days of introducing USDC collateral, the DAI was trading much stronger than it is currently. And basically the other reason is debt auctions. So the most important part of this analysis is basically activity of what these vaults are doing. So I was checking transactions of these vaults and kind of tried to label them based on the main activity. You can see the, like on this chart, you can see that roughly 50% of debt is basically being issued towards accumulation. I labeled this as accumulation, but this is basically probably mainly used for basically auctions, liquidity. And then roughly 40% of debt was used for managing DAI premium, basically selling DAI and locking USDC. Now maybe let's talk first about vaults which are issuing DAI to basically lower the peg, to trade the peg. So we can see here that 5 of these top 10 vaults are using I-earns leverage DAI short contract, which allows you to basically leverage your DAI short position with one transaction. And there are also 2 vaults who are doing the same thing, but manually. Now, the 2 most important vaults are the largest vault and the 5th largest vault, who are basically accumulating DAI. Now I was able to connect this vault with an account which is related to different accounts which participated and also won some of the flop auctions. So this is basically a keeper. And like another quite important thing which I found out is that these 2 accounts which were accumulating DAI are also related to some accounts which are basically the largest players in Compound. So basically,
sorry, can you go back to the pie chart for a sec, to the right?
Yeah. So basically, 50% is accumulation. This is presented by 2 vaults, the largest one and the 5th largest one, and then basically 40% of debt is people are being DAI away. Okay, so like what I wanted to say, so like why I'm mentioning these compound positions is because DAI premium is extremely dangerous for basically DAI denominated debt in other protocols, which is not Maker, because these protocols use market price, which means that you can actually get liquidated faster in Compound if you are borrowing DAI than in Maker, right? If DAI goes above the peg. So yeah, I just wanted to show this. Basically, this is, so like the largest vault, which I showed before, is related to this address, which is the largest ETH supplier in Compound. As you can see, his position is quite large, 155K ETH and 600K USDC collateral in Compound, and he is borrowing 3.7 million DAI from Compound. So this is his collateral ratio. If we assume that DAI is worth 1, and basically this is his current actual collateral ratio in Compound, because assuming that the price is 100, and you can see that it's basically lower than it would be if this same position would be structured in Maker. And then the 5th largest vault, which I showed before here, this guy is also accumulating, and basically he is related to another account, which is also a very large like player in Compound. He is supplying 9 million USDC collateral and borrowing 5.7 million DAI. And as you can see, he's much more leveraged compared to the first account. Yeah, this is basically it for me. Oh, and maybe like the only important thing which I forgot to mention, that these 2 accounts which are trading, by hand, not using I-earns contract,
are mostly using aggregators such as Paraswap or 1inch to basically optimize slippage.
Cool.
Yeah,
thank you. That was
that's
awesome.
it.
That was great.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, cool. So yeah, I guess the main takeaway for me is that that about half the USDC is being used for the flop auctions. I'm just guessing, and then the other half is being used for die peg liquidity. So this just kind of continues the discussion on what we want USDC for. If we do want to target both use cases, then I think it might be preferable to split them up into two separate collateral types, the USDC A and the USDC B, with parameters and debt ceilings targeting each specific use case. I don't really have like a huge update or anything on this. I just want to make sure that this conversation is still top of mind for the community. If we want to add another collateral type, if we want to increase or decrease debt ceilings and stability fees, because this is happening through governance polls and through executive votes, one way or another. But I think we can do a little bit better job of staying on top of it.
Cyrus, for me, the key takeaway here was that we need to get the flop auctions off the table, in which case, do we need to have a USDC A and B?
Yeah, we still would, because we want to make sure that there is sufficient USDC debt ceiling for the flip auctions, actually, for the collateral auctions, in case there were to be ETH were to suffer another huge drawdown. That was kind of the original impetus behind adding USDC, was to make sure that keepers had enough DAI on hand to bid on the ETH collateral auctions. That they used it for the flop auctions is actually kind of like a welcome side benefit, because that was actually another like 5 million DAI that would have been drained from the primary DAI supply. That would have been painful as well. So I think it's fair to frame it as one for all auctions, or the flip and the flop auctions, and then another type for DAI peg management.
Right, cool, thanks.
Cyrus, do you have any ideas at the moment on how you're thinking about measuring that the extra liquidity will actually be used or is being used on the flop auctions?
I'm assuming that the accumulation portion that Marko was referring to was hitting the flop auctions. Was it not?
Yeah, like the large, I mean, you know, I cannot say with 100% certainty that this specific DAI was used for flops, you know, considering that this entity holds, you know, another positions in the ecosystem. But yeah, he is generally related to 3 different accounts who won some of the flop auctions.
Cool. Okay.
Does that answer your question, I guess?
Yeah, I'm mostly thinking about like the actual flow from the transaction of generating to the actual use in the flop, because there might be, even though actually the generation of the liquidity might be read as 100% going into the flop auctions, if we potentially look into the data, maybe actually shows that actually only a much smaller percentage of actually goes into them into those flop auctions.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, like I just wanted to say that, yeah, definitely I will check this, but like what I wanted to say is that, these accounts are quite large, and it's really hard to say, did this entity print DAI for this, specific auction, or did maybe want to already build some kind of liquidity for, potential collateral auctions if it would continue to fall.
Yeah, I also think that we can, I was kind of just informally thinking that we just wait for all the flop auctions to end and have it be done before we kind of do a more detailed analysis. So I think maybe that's why there's also not all the information right now.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's just whether there was actually the framework of thinking about it to measure from the beginning when it started deploying USDC to actually once we have cured the whole queue, kind of going back into it is actually the use case that we're expecting and the results that we obtained at the end. We cured actually the queue, but how much of that liquidity actually flew into the expected result that we wanted? That's more like what I was thinking.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, we definitely should do that. Okay, so maybe we can talk about this a bit at the end. Let's also move on a bit. So Vishesh, do you want to jump into the state of the peg?
Sure. Okay. So just start off simple. In terms of what the peg has been doing over the last week, it's basically been hovering at $1.02 or a little before, or a little above. So though the ETH price has continued to fluctuate between 120 and 140 in that time frame, the peg has been holding relatively steady, and that's because there haven't been major fluctuations in the ETH DAI supply in that same time frame. So basically, after that March 12th to 13th timeframe, once the DAI supply came down to about 77 million over the course of some liquidations finishing out over the next few days, it kind of fell to about 68 million, and then has kind of held steady since then. And so that's why in that sort of similar time frame, the peg has not moved significantly. So we had obviously all the craziness on Black Thursday, where the price on an average basis went up to about $1.07, at times $1.10. On a weighted average basis, it was about $1.10 or about $1.07 most of the time. Though some of those trades just experienced crazy amounts of slippage in that time frame. So some of the highest deviations were what happened on Uniswap, but a decent chunk of the volume was continuing on DYDX, and a lot of those trades were around $1.07 to $1.10 at sort of their highest point. And then obviously Uniswap saw crazy slippage in both directions, as it usually does. But basically, after the insane spikes, the DAI price started to come down a bit. And then as DAI was being sourced for a large number of liquidations and auctions, after that, then it began to run up again a bit. And a lot of that was happening on both DYDX, but also Oasis sort of reclaiming a share of the trading volume, which had been lost to DYDX over the past couple of months. Yeah, that sort of held steady high around $1.07 for a while, and then came back down to about $1.03, $1.04. And then, around 5-6 days ago, came back down a little bit further to about $1.03 and $1.02, and has been fluctuating in that $1.02, $1.03 range in the last week or so. And part of the reasoning for this is there's still holdouts from auctions. There's still uncertainty from people, I think, in terms of when the peg will come back down to $1. And so there's some hesitancy, I think, from some market makers, some arbitrageurs to sell more DAI. Plus the minting, as we said, has been down because the total supply has been pretty flat in the last week or so. So in order to incentivize more minting of DAI, you know, there has been a lot of conversation about stability fees, but it primarily has to do with sentiment and arbitrage opportunity. So, you know, as was just talked about with the USDC vaults, so you can see here is the USDC DAI supply. So from inception, that sort of grew quickly to about 6.7 million. And, you know, this was basically a few large keepers sourcing liquidity, getting ready for auctions. A little bit more activity in the last couple of days, which sort of came right back down. And then in the last, you know, couple of hours, there was another small drop. So basically this has been holding pretty flat and been by and large used by keepers for the purposes of sourcing DAI for auctions. But this supply growth as like a target for incentivizing more DAI being minted is been a conversation that people have been having. In terms of, you know, potentially lowering that stability fee. And then if we also look at the ETH DAI supply, like, you know, the stability fee is very low currently for ETH. And that's not really incentivizing people to mint more, because right now it seems like the sentiment on what ETH's next moves are is extremely uncertain. And it's just, I think, causing a lot of traders and system participants to be hesitant to wanting to mint that much more DAI and sell it. And so in terms of when will DAI return to peg, this may, you know, hover at around $1.02 for a little while longer. And that may be a persistent effect until people become more comfortable with re-leveraging on ETH. And you know, there is obviously that thread around USDC, but that's not likely to be a huge source of DAI minting in the coming days in the current iteration. You know, as Cyrus said, if we offer a different option for how the USDC vault is structured, that's more geared towards arbitrage, that may change, but
Are people still here?
Yeah, I'm still here.
I
Yes.
thought it was my internet.
I think yes. So I think I read it.
The one time we don't talk about the battery charge.
What was his battery at?
No, I was listening to what he was saying like a fool.
Yeah, there was a bunch of new graphs there. We're still actually only working locally for the moment, so that's probably why I burned all the battery during those.
Maybe we can move on, and then when you I mean, I hate to move on and then he comes right back. So just pinged him right now.
I guess maybe we discuss USDC a bit.
Well, because we have one more very, very quick, short presentation from Primoz, and then we can jump into Q&A. Primoz, why don't you go ahead and get started?
Okay.
If you want.
Okay. So SCD migration, current size supply at 14.1. It decreased 1.4 million in the past week. It wasn't as heavy as two weeks ago when we had Black Thursday event, and I guess SCD or CDPs were kind of rushing for exits. You know, they might have been scared of full Ether dilution, but still there were some repayments past week as well. As I said, 1.4 million. On the other hand, the signed migration contract didn't really fall as heavily, only for about $500,000. And that's mainly because Sai is still migrating using migration contract to DAI. And here you can see the flow over the past few weeks. About 1 million Sai was deposited to migration contract, about 100,000 per day. So the values are a bit smaller than weeks before, but Sai is still migrating. Some stats for the past week. As I said, 1.4 million net repayment. These were the CDPs that repaid their debt fully, 54 of them. We had one really large CDP, I'm going to show you later. This was the second largest CDP, actually, who closed his debt. And the system also collected about 130,000 of fees. And the remaining fees currently are 1.5 million. But basically 1 million is represented by largest CDP. So basically there's 500,000 we are waiting for because that CDP hasn't shown any type of activity for, I think, last 10 months or something. Migration contract, as I said, dropped only for about 500,000. So the current inventory is 3.3. What's good from CDP perspective is that they now have 1/4 of the supply available in the migration contract. So if they need to do a repayment, there's quite a lot of supply there now in percentage terms. I've showed this already. So side to DAI migration on each day, and then the largest CDP. So the ones who repaid their debt, this was the largest one, repaying 800,000 last week. I think he also paid about $90,000 in fees alone. Then we still have some CDPs with collateralization ratio below 150. So auction, I'm not sure why still hasn't. 34 of CDPs. The amount is actually a bit lower than it was 2 weeks ago. So the situation improved. In terms of liquidity, liquidations, and how much it could affect the system, the answer now, because it's a bit. So say if Ether drops 40 to 50%, we should see about 2 to 3 million debt liquidated, which is still okay, I guess, because we have this liquidity available in migration contract. And that's pretty much it. To conclude, I was a bit, I wasn't expecting such a high degree of repayments past week, because I was kind of thinking that, if Ether prices are stable or, even bounced as they did, why would they really rush for exits? But it seems there's still some kind of tendency from 2 weeks ago when some of them got scared, if Ether drops, their collateral might get diluted and so on. So it's really hard to say what happens next. All I think, the thing which I think is important is that if there is a shutdown and Sai inventory needs to be drained, there needs to be this thing that we discussed the last time, and that we need to disable the one-way bridge from Sai to DAI, because people are still migrating Sai. And also perhaps we should lower SED debt ceiling. You still hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. Told me connection is not stable. Perhaps SED debt ceiling reduction might be also good, because we still see some PSI minting, and it's totally doesn't make sense because there's enough PSI liquidity now. So we really don't want to see PSI minting, although that debt doesn't really carry any interests anyway. So not sure. That's it.
Awesome, thanks. Why don't we quickly wrap up Vishesh's portion, and we can just do questions at the end for all the presentations.
Sure. Sorry about the disconnect.
Wait, was it a disconnect or was it battery? We were all trying to.
It was a disconnect. It was a network went out at the exact moment that I was talking. So yeah, I'll just try and finish up quick then. So yeah, I mean, we went over sort of what was going on with DAI price. The USDC vaults. So what we actually saw was even though the net amount of USDC DAI activity kind of leveled out, the collateralization actually of some of those USDC vaults increased from when this was initially launched. So that's kind of curious why some of them have a little extra collateral in them, but that it's not significant numbers compared to the ETH vaults currently. So I think we just wait and see a little bit on how USDC is being used. But in terms of the ETH vaults, so it was interesting to note, this this liquidation wall had gone down to say $56 mid-crisis. It has come back up to about 69. So just, I think people are feeling a little bit more comfortable because that's despite the ETH price coming back up to about 130. So just something to watch, that people are doing their usual behavior of as price levels out, they also level out their amount of collateral relative to the debt. And the debt amount has not moved much significantly post crisis and liquidation. So that's primarily collateral actions that we're seeing. So just something to be aware of. And then, we talked about USDC and DAI supplies. So I'll just sort of leave it there. There's some other stuff in terms of liquidations and stuff that we can talk about, but I'll just leave that for questions or if people want to ask afterwards, since this is my second time talking on the call.
So can I ask one question here, Vishesh? So I would have expected to see a bit of an S drop on your collateral chart that corresponded to that, and I didn't really see it.
In terms of the collateral ratio of ETH vaults?
I don't know if you actually showed like just the total S in the vaults. I thought I saw that chart, but I would have expected to see, since it looks like they withdrew collateral, that, we went from, I don't know, 58 to like 70 almost. I would have expected to see like a 10% drop on ETH and as collateral. I thought you had a chart on that, and I just didn't see a dip there, but it could have been something else like liquidation ratio or something.
DAI supply, and then this was the USDC collateral supply. But I didn't show a chart here on the ETH collateral supply. I can show that after the call as well if you want to see. But
that just explains what I was seeing. So I appreciate that. Thanks. So.
But yeah, the amount of ETH collateral relative to the amount of ETH DAI has proportionately gotten riskier. So there is less ETH in dollar terms than there's less ETH in nominal terms than there was during the crash compared to the amount of debt. So it has gotten a bit riskier again. But that makes sense, just to be clear, because what we and this is not about the bottom tier, like the riskiest positions, because that has not been a hugely significant change. This is more about the percentage of the higher collateralizations to the medium collateralizations has decreased. So basically, people that have a little bit of a buffer are feeling a little bit more comfortable now than they were mid-crisis. That's roughly how I would read it.
Yeah.
Questions on the setup of two types of USDC collateral that Cyrus you mentioned. How does the system restrict the usage or direct the usage of the DAI from the each types? Like how can you restrict the usage even when you have two risk parameters set up for two types of USDC?
You can't really restrict them unless you have the debt ceiling set to 0 and then have to do an emergency executive to raise it, which is a lot of overhead, or potentially one day in the future that could be made easier through some sort of instant access module, for example. But practically speaking, if you just set the stability fee prohibitively high for one of them, then that would then that could also help take care of that. So if you set the stability fee high enough such that a keeper is unlikely to make money using it for DAI peg arbitrage, then that would effectively restrict it.
So it can only go one way. So it can only set higher rate to kind of stop the keepers from arbitrage, but it's no better to lower the current rate.
Yeah, so it would. So the current one would go, presumably would go way lower, and then the other one would go way higher. So the issue is right now we have this kind of hybrid strategy where the stability fee is in the middle, which is probably not desirable.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Thanks.
Do you think we should be like actively like polling and things on making like the second?
I think there's a lot of things we need to proactively do, and
Yeah, I know, right?
not just for the USDC, but also also for the circuit breaker itself. And then I think what's most important here is like a holistic execution strategy, because these are all kind of very active measures that governance needs to be involved with. And up to now, I mean, typically this community is more of like a passive governance type of ecosystem. So that's a bit concerning. So I definitely think that we can do some work and just.
Do you mean you kind of want like a better definition of like when to use certain tools, right? Like so we use
when like thresholds and criteria, thresholds and, and then how does it actually get going? Like once a community says we want to do XYZ, like how do we actually ensure that it happens in a timely manner?
Right. I mean, we can't really because Maker holders and things.
Right.
But yeah, I know what you mean.
But yeah, this is kind of more of a medium-term project, but one that I think is definitely of high priority.
Are there any other questions from anyone about anything that's happened in the whole call so far?
I've got a question for Vishesh. So Vishesh, on that collateralization distribution for USDC, those 150 plus bucket that you have there, do you got any hypothesis, like back of your mind, thoughts of why that would be?
Yeah, I do. So, and apologies for any background noise, but I mean, my sense right now is that there are people who have, USDC that they're sitting on, waiting to potentially arbitrage or participate in liquidations. But no, Aaron, I just live by a train. So they're not actively necessarily maxing out their DAI withdrawing abilities right now, but they're sort of preparing to act in the event that there's a profit opportunity, would be my most likely guess.
And therefore potentially kind of just having a cost of their capital that they are willing to actually to bear upfront.
Yeah, and the other thing is the ecosystem has slightly changed, right? So Maker adopting USDC as a collateral, like observing changes the observed, and so it's possible that possible and likely, I would say, that there's been a bit of a shift in how keepers are thinking about what proportions of which assets to hold. Keepers and arbitrageurs and market makers, in the sense that USDC may become a bit more common part of the vernacular now, in that there's a cycle that exists between ETH, DAI, and USDC, whereas prior it may have been more explicitly just ETH and DAI. So now holding the right amount of USDC at the right times, I think, becomes a bigger part of their workflows, given that USDC can now be used as a leverage point to create more DAI when there is an opportunity to arbitrage DAI.
Yeah, makes sense. Cool.
Well, and let's also add that the OSM there is fixed to 1, and there's literally no liquidations that are happening on USDC. In effect, you don't have to worry about what you deposit to mint DAI there. So it's kind of a really different ecosystem. I want to go back to this S thing that I think, if this was a risk-on event, people would have left their S deposited and they would have minted DAI to go up to 70. Instead, they withdrew S and let their liquidation ratio go up. I think that's a confidence event, not a risk-on event.
Can I also point out one other correlation in behavior, which is if you look at March 23rd to 24th, that was actually a period where there was a bit more USDC DAI minted out, about 1 million more. And then after the 24th, that million or so was paid back. And what actually happened to DAI peg during that time was, post all the craziness, the price had been lowering till it hit around $1 at the end of the 22nd. So on the 23rd, it started rising back up all of a sudden to sort of breaking that trend to like $1.03 up to $1.04. On Oasis, there were times when it was $1.07. And then after the 24th, it started coming back down again. So there is some relationship there between the hump in the amount of USDC DAI issued and sort of a quick re-increase in where the DAI peg was trading at. So, that actually does start to track in the sense that people having this USDC balance, sort of waiting for times when DAI rises above peg to mint more DAI out and arbitrage it back down.
And were there actually events?
I was one of those guys in that $1 million thing that I basically arbed in, and then I unwound it via FDAI trading, basically, and USDC F trading, basically. So yeah, I was a piece of that $1 million that did precisely that. So I think that $1 million is like a reasonable number based on what I saw in the markets and pricing. That it just didn't have enough of an effect, that the rest of this DAI went somewhere else. It didn't go to the peg. It literally went somewhere else.
And that's where we can sort of start to talk about how people were thinking about auctions and whatnot. But it is interesting, just as a data point, to see those explanations track to people's actual communicated behaviors. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up one point, which I don't think anybody's talked about, which is there are a bunch of ETH vault holders that lost a lot of capital, right, in this downturn. And is there anybody thinking like maybe they've lost confidence in the Maker system to open up new vaults? And maybe that's why the DAI supply is not increasing? Like they could choose other platforms to kind of...
That's totally my take on this, okay, is that the more than 50% or at least half of this is a confidence effect. And so it's the real deal, and it's a real issue. I don't know how much we restore that confidence if we do anything about it, but I think that's a real effect here, and we can't ignore it.
I would agree with that I think it's real, but you know, if you consider the proportion of vaults that lost during that event in that way versus the total proportion of vaults, it isn't the biggest chunk. And also, like, I think there are things we know, there are things we don't know, and then there are things we don't know we don't know. And I just want to point out the things that we do know is, sure, there is definitely likely some effect of impact on confidence that is greater than 0 and less than 100%. And we also can pretty reasonably say that based on what we've seen how ETH price works in the past and the correlation between how ETH price works and how it impacts leveraging behavior, this is not new. This is most definitely not the first time we've seen sort of a freeze on minting new DAI post a large volatility event in ETH. So the impact of just what's going on with ETH price is also greater than 0 and less than 100%. Now, how much we're going to assign weighting of different effects going on at the same time is highly subjective conversation. We wouldn't necessarily be able to get great quantitative data to answer that question. But what we know is that both of those are greater than 0 and less than 100. What we don't know is what are the exact proportions of impacts of those two things. So I just want to make it clear there are multiple things going on at once, that there's no way that is the complete explanation.
Yeah, so to sort of summarize this, we don't know how much we can attribute to Maker and how much we can attribute it to ETH.
Well, we do have some indicative data that in this range, you know, that when the price went up, we do see a lag before the peg comes down. I see it on that chart from the 23rd to the 25th. It wasn't clear after the whole market machinations, you know, the whole debacle. But there is a lag effect. It does seem to have some importance. And literally Maker only has, I mean, the amount of collateral in the system, only so much DAI can be minted. You know, so I agree. Yeah, it's between a 0 and 100, and we really don't know the exact data, and that the peg still follows general market machinations, and we haven't had enough of a bull run to really push the peg down and for people to maybe take on a little bit, I wouldn't say more risk, but to have freedom in their vaults to be able to mint. You know, I think what they did was they pulled F because they're like, holy crap, if there's another event and I don't get liquidated, I really don't want to lose it all. And so, you know, we see kind of an effect on that to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, I was purely answering about DAI minting. If we look at, you know, general DAI trading and arbitrage activity, and if you start to talk about faith in the peg, et cetera, market effects are the prime driver. I will make that statement because if you look at historically how DAI peg has fluctuated in times of large ETH volatility, the function snaps into a very high correlation real quick. Now this fluctuates over long time frames. So if you look at like a 90-day time frame, the correlation between the ETH price movement and the DAI peg drops, but it's still like a 55%, you know, Pearson correlation. If you look at in times of high volatility, like you know, post Black Thursday,
the correlation is really high. Yeah,
it jumps to like 80% negative correlation between what's going on with ETH.
Completely agree.
Exactly.
Yeah, I completely agree on that. Yeah,
that's so clear there. Yeah. Yeah.
I think the point I just want to make is that, you know, if you were to look at a curve of confidence, we're kind of very high right now, or low. And so, you know, while the market, I think you're right that the market, you know, Vishesh, that the market does dominate this whole scene. But I really don't want to underplay the confidence being kind of at all-time lows here.
But are we actually I guess there's the event that happens, but are we jumping to the conclusion maybe too quickly in terms of calling it necessarily confidence? Because I understand that there's one metric that potentially talking about like confidence there, which is minting, right? But we still don't know whether there's actually other metrics that actually would allow us to, like maybe like the minting and the velocity of minting, and the fact that people are not, you know, leveraging as much, but maybe they're not leveraging as much just because of the recency of the event.
Well, it's not just recency, right? So an old analysis that I did with ETH was looking at short-term averages versus long-term averages. And I'll revisit this analysis, but basically the idea being how quote unquote cheap people think ETH is in the short term compared to the long term, I think often has a strong relationship to you know, DAI being minted and the DAI supply. So my point actually, if anything, was I don't think you can draw this simple conclusion that it's a confidence issue, because
I agree with that.
too well with what are the impacts of simply ETH price on DAI peg and DAI supply that we've seen in the past.
Well, there's another component of confidence that's pretty much at an all-time low. The confidence that ETH isn't just going to go through the floor. You know, so when I'm saying confidence, I am saying Maker, but I'm just saying generally confidence in the markets as well as in Maker. And so you put those two factors together, you literally have confidence at an all-time low. People really don't want to take risk. It's a risk-off event here.
Yeah, it may be semantically helpful to differentiate confidence in the protocol versus sentiment on ETH. And I think ETH sentiment is the prime driver very often with what's going on with Maker.
Yep, completely agree on that.
Yeah. Cool.
I think
what's interesting is on the contrasting that people who deposit USDC and borrowing DAI and do this arbitrage, they are 100% or nearly 100% confident because they cannot get liquidated, but they are reluctant to arbitrage the current 3%, and probably that is because of the high interest rate, and we have to think because it's still gonna take 2 weeks if all things if all people vote for a lower one, it's still gonna take 2 weeks at least to have a rate below 10%, which means that after 1 week, those who borrowed DAI 2 weeks ago, will be at the break-even point, and this only takes 1 week. They will be losing money by being the first actor of the arbitrager, and they will buy DAI from the market and close their USDC position if the stability stay still high at that point, and that will be another upside pressure for DAI. So my suggestion is that do we want to give directional vote for the USDC stability fee? Like we really don't want a higher one than current 20%, right? And also considering we were talking about the SCD emergency shutdown, there are 10 million debt in the system, which means that the only way they can pay back the debt is by either buy the DAI on the market, which they are probably not going to do, or using USDC and generate DAI. So they are all upside pressure for DAI.
Yeah. So regarding the point of like the initial arbitrators closing out when they get to the point of break even, because if that pushes the DAI price up again, because the USDC stability fee is now lower, you should see like another wave of like arbitrators take advantage of that and push it down again.
You guys keep saying arbitrateurs. Can you explain the arbitrage to me, because I don't see that?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I can try. So essentially, you have USDC, you mint it, you lock it in the USDC vaults. you know DAI is trading for like above $1.
Yep.
So you mint DAI with that USDC, you
Yep.
sell it for more than $1 for USDC,
Yep.
and then you have more USDC than you did DAI. And then in the future, hopefully, like this is what you're betting on, right? Like you're betting in the future that DAI will continue to come down.
Exactly. So it's not an arbitrage. It's not a complete arbitrage.
It's not
You're
an atomic
putting in
arbitrage.
a lot of risk. If you sell that DAI and it doesn't, and the DAI doesn't come back down, for you to buy the DAI at a cheaper price, it is not an arbitrage.
Yeah,
so you're actually betting on market events.
Yeah, so this is, I think, the biggest hesitancy with engaging in the USDC collateral type right now for the purpose of arbitrage is you don't know how much time you're going to be stuck in your DAI position before that price comes back down, which means you don't know exactly how much of a stability fee you're going to pay. And at, you know, around 20%, that's not an inconsiderable number.
Isn't that a case for a lower stability fee? So they can just push the price down without thinking of the interest they're accumulating significantly. Because that's it, all of this is expectation on the DAI price. If people, even for the USDC lenders, if they hold the expectation that the price, the premium was still there, they will still not act even when the stability fee goes down. There's no new market maker jumping to this, what we call arbitrage.
It is definitely possible to make that argument, but the bigger point I think that's going to overshadow this is until people are confident that ETH is going to continue to be stable, likely there will continue to be a premium on DAI because DAI, as has now been shown to the market, is a very useful and valuable asset in times of great ETH volatility, in that either the price runs up and you have an arbitrage opportunity, or that you can use it to essentially take advantage of discounts on liquidations. And because it has these use cases, in addition to the ability to get a passive yield, that asset is pretty valuable and potentially arguably more valuable than the US dollar currently. And so that's where, or at least, you know, compared to USDC currently. And so that's where I think, you know, that combined with the fact that the supply just took a huge haircut, though demand may not necessarily have taken as big of a haircut, that it may continue to just trade at a premium until the overall market sentiment changes.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's suggesting that USDC, like the USDC vault, is like a permanent solution to the DAI peg, right? No one's suggesting that it's not eventually going to require those users to like sell back to DAI, right, to close their positions. The point is it spreads out like the liquidity crunch, right? So ultimately, yes, the people that are using that and like us in general are relying on, like Vishesh said, like ETH, like more confidence or sentiment, like returning for ETH, right, and people opening more ETH denominated like vaults.
Well, to me, like out of all the different actors, the actor that is acting the least rational, in my opinion, is the DAI holders in the DSR. If you're putting DAI in the DSR, you're expecting some small interest, right? Like 3 to 4%. Well, you can grab 2% right now, right? But nobody's doing that.
I mostly agree.
Yeah, let me comment on that one, because we don't know where the DAI is coming from. It literally could, let's say Compound has a chunk of that. We can actually look at that number. But the secondary markets, like on Compound, I can deposit DAI and I can borrow other stuff. And that DAI ends up being deposited in the DSR. I'm pretty sure that the vast majority of that 25 million that's in the DSR right now is kind of locked there because people have borrowed other assets that they aren't paying back for some reason. It's a speculation, but it's the only explanation I can come up with for that behavior that you're talking about. Let me say something else. So I agree with you that this whole USDC to mint DAI, it isn't an ARB event. An arbitrage event, because I did it, was to like sell on Coinbase at 104 and buy on DYDX at like 103. That's it's simultaneously. That's a true ARB event. But then I had to unwind that what we're talking about is a DAI put. is what's in, and it looks like literally 1/6 of what's out there did the did the put to and maybe some ARB, and then unwound it fairly quickly. Whereas we've got 6 million sitting out there waiting for auctions at 20%, which is why I'm kind of, as an arbor and a person who might take on that die short at some time, I'm going to unravel that faster than fast. And whether the price is 20% or 30%, I don't give a hoot, because I'm going to unwind that in a way that I'm going to make money, and I'm going to do it fast. And I did. And the other people are sitting there sitting on it, and I don't like them sitting on it. So I want to go up in the SF just to see if we can even tap on those people to do anything, to be an active maintainer that does something with the system and then observes a response, and then we can make a call as to whether we think we should go down or further up to eliminate some of this behavior. It's a debate we should have.
You're discounting one fact, which is the reason people created that die or minted that die or borrowed that die is to set up for the auctions, right? And the issue is we had no idea when the auctions are going to happen, right? Because governance takes its time. So it could have happened as quickly as Monday. It could have happened Friday. We're still not sure when it's going to happen. So that's probably the reason that's still sitting there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but my point is if you're really going to do that, are you really going to sit there and pay a high fee? You would mint it and then use it fast and unwind it out fast. This is a facility that I imagined was an emergency facility that people would go into and get out of quickly, that they wouldn't just sit there and wait.
And I agree
at
with you.
20%, right?
Emergency facility, but the reason they're using it for the emergency, that timeline is all over the place, right? We could have run a vote on Saturday, like last Saturday, and gotten.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm gonna have to actually end the meeting soon. So maybe we can take this into the forums. I'd love to carry this conversation forward. I hate to cut you guys off like this, but unfortunately, I gotta call it. All right, thanks a lot, everybody. Great discussions, great analysis. Pick this up again.
Yep.
Soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.